December 17th, 1944. A captured American ammunition depot near Stavelot, Belgium. German engineers from Army Group B's Technical Intelligence Unit stood in the frozen warehouse, flashlights illuminating row after row of artillery shells marked with an unfamiliar designation. P.O.Z.I.T. The abbreviation meant nothing to Hauptmann Werner Schaefer, but the sheer quantity suggested something significant. Over 600 shells equipped with fuses unlike anything in Wehrmacht inventory. Small, compact devices mounted in the shell nose, containing what appeared to be miniature radio components sealed behind metal housings. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Schaefer couldn't know as he carefully extracted one of these fuses for shipment to the Technical Research Office in Berlin was that he held in his hands the culmination of a 4-year American scientific effort that would prove Germany had fallen catastrophically behind in the race for technological supremacy. The VT proximity fuse represented not just an incremental improvement in artillery effectiveness, but a revolution in warfare that American industry had mass-produced, while German engineers still struggled with laboratory prototypes that would never reach the battlefield. The frozen Belgian winter of 1944 was about to deliver a lesson in industrial might that no amount of theoretical German engineering superiority could overcome. The mathematics of technological development were about to reveal a truth German leadership had refused to acknowledge. Innovation, without the industrial capacity to implement it at scale, was functionally worthless in total war. The American program's origins reached back to mid-1940, when the National Defense Research Committee assembled under Vannevar Bush's leadership to coordinate military research. The Navy's wish list topped with a seemingly impossible requirement: develop a fuse that could detonate an anti-aircraft shell in proximity to a target without physical contact. Every military power had recognized this need for decades. The concept was simple. The execution appeared insurmountable. Traditional artillery fuses required either direct impact or time-based detonation set before firing. Against modern aircraft capable of 400 miles per hour, both methods proved grossly inadequate. A timed fuse demanded perfect prediction of target position seconds in advance. Any error in calculation, wind drift, or target maneuver rendered the shell harmless. Impact fuses required direct hits on targets measuring perhaps 30 feet across, while traveling at speeds that made visual tracking nearly impossible. The mathematics were brutal. Naval studies showed 5-inch guns required 1,000 shells with timed fuses to destroy a single aircraft. This expenditure rate was unsustainable against mass air attacks. Dr. Merle Tuve at the Carnegie Institution inherited the proximity fuse problem in August 1940. A physicist who had spent years working on radar and radio propagation, Tuve understood immediately that radio frequency sensing offered the only practical solution. The concept was elegant. A miniature radio transmitter in the fuse would broadcast a signal. When the shell approached a target, the reflected signal would strengthen. At the optimal distance, the fuse would detect this increase and detonate the shell. In theory, in practice, the challenges bordered on absurd. The fuse needed to survive being fired from a 5-inch gun, subjecting its components to acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity. The shell would spin at hundreds of revolutions per second. The electronics had to function in temperatures ranging from Arctic cold to the heat of rapid firing. The radar system had to distinguish between genuine targets and ground, clutter, waves, or clouds. It needed a power source that would activate only after firing, preventing accidental detonation. Every component had to be manufactured cheaply enough for mass production, as millions would be needed. Most critically, every element had to fit inside a fuse housing smaller than a coffee can. This meant miniaturizing vacuum tube technology to dimensions never before attempted in production electronics. The commercial radio industry used tubes the size of a human thumb. Tuve needed tubes no larger than a pencil eraser that could withstand forces that would shatter conventional glass bulbs into powder. The program transferred to Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory in early 1941, a facility hastily established in a converted warehouse in Silver Spring, Maryland. The laboratory grew to employ 3% of all American physicists by 1943. Security measures matched those protecting the Manhattan Project. Workers couldn't discuss their assignments even with family members. Each fuse carried unique serial numbers for tracking. The designation VT fuse was deliberately vague, standing for variable time to obscure the device's actual function. Dr. James Van Allen led the miniaturization effort for vacuum tubes. The breakthrough came through manufacturing techniques that would revolutionize post-war electronics. Tubes were constructed with internal supports that distributed stress across multiple points, preventing catastrophic failure under acceleration. Glass compositions were modified for increased strength. Filaments and grids were redesigned to function while spinning at extreme speeds. By January 1942, Van Allen's team had produced tubes capable of surviving cannon fire. The battery problem proved equally challenging. Conventional batteries either lacked sufficient power or couldn't withstand the firing shock. National Carbon Company developed an ingenious solution. A sealed, glass ampule contained electrolyte fluid separated from zinc and carbon plates. The firing acceleration would shatter the ampule. Centrifugal force from the shell's spin would distribute the electrolyte to the plates, generating electrical current that powered the fuse for its brief flight. This wet cell design provided stable power and longer shelf life than dry cell alternatives. Testing progressed through 1942 with mounting urgency. The first live fire test occurred on January 29, 1942. 52% of the launched fuses activated successfully. While falling short of the desired 80% reliability, this rate proved sufficient for the Navy Bureau of Ordnance to authorize pilot production at the Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio. By August 19, 1942, the newly commissioned light cruiser USS Cleveland conducted evaluation tests in Chesapeake Bay. 3 target drones, small aircraft under remote control, served as targets. Gunners destroyed all 3 drones on the first day with just 4 bursts of proximity-fused ammunition. The Navy cancelled the remainder of the scheduled testing. The weapon worked. Mass production began immediately. Sylvania Electric Products received the contract for vacuum tube manufacturing. The company established production lines staffed primarily by women, employing 10,000 personnel at peak output. They produced 1 million tubes every 2.5 days, 2/3 the rate of the entire pre-war American radio industry. Each tube underwent exhaustive testing. Quality control procedures established for fuse production would become industry standards for decades. By late 1943, American factories assembled 40,000 proximity fuses daily. Over 100 companies contributed to production, from RCA and General Electric to smaller, specialized manufacturers. The program cost reached $1 billion in 1940s currency, rivaling the Manhattan Project for expenditure. The cost per fuse fell from $732 in 1942 to $18 by 1945 as production techniques matured and volumes increased. The first combat use occurred on January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal. The light cruiser USS Helena engaged 4 Japanese Aichi dive bombers with proximity-fused shells. 3 shells were fired with minimal time for aiming. All 3 detonated near a retreating dive bomber, downing the aircraft without a direct hit. Admiral Halsey's task forces reported immediate effectiveness against Japanese air attacks. The mathematics proved decisive. Where conventional ammunition required thousands of shells per kill, proximity fuses reduced this to hundreds, then dozens. However, Admiral Ernest King and the combined Chiefs of Staff imposed absolute restrictions on deployment. No proximity-fused ammunition could be used where the enemy might recover unexploded examples. The technology was too valuable to risk. Naval engagements occurred over open ocean where dud shells sank beyond recovery. This restriction would hold for nearly 2 years, despite Army demands for access to the weapon. The German parallel program followed a tragically different trajectory. German engineers had begun proximity fuse research in the early 1930s, actually predating American efforts. The Reich Research Council sponsored multiple approaches. Rheinmetall Borsig developed acoustic fuses that detected engine sound. The Electroacoustic Institute pursued infrared sensing. Various organizations explored electrostatic, photoelectric, and radio-based designs. By 1939, German researchers had demonstrated working laboratory prototypes of several systems. Then came the Führer Directive of 1940. Hitler's order terminated any research project that could not reach production within 6 months. The rationale appeared sound, given Germany's planned rapid conquest of Europe. Resources would concentrate on immediately deployable weapons to support Operation Barbarossa. The proximity fuse program halted. Research teams disbanded. Prototype work ceased. The decision would prove catastrophic. While Germany diverted resources to projects deemed more immediately necessary, American industry was building the infrastructure for mass production of a weapon Germany had abandoned. The P.O.Z.I.T mission of September 1940 brought British proximity fuse research to American scientists, accelerating development that would eventually produce 22 million operational fuses. German engineers didn't recognize their error until far too late. By 1943, intelligence reports reaching Berlin described unusual Allied anti-aircraft effectiveness in the Pacific. German technical intelligence struggled to explain the phenomenon. Their analysis correctly identified that the Allies possessed some form of improved anti-aircraft fuse, but the details remained elusive. Captured Allied aviators couldn't provide information about naval weapons they'd never seen. The secrets remained protected by thousands of miles of ocean. The weapon's true capabilities remained hidden from German forces until June 1944. The V-1 flying bomb campaign against England provided the first devastating demonstration. British heavy anti-aircraft guns deployed along the English coast fired proximity-fused shells at the approaching pilotless missiles. In the campaign's first week, only 17% of P.O.Z.I.T were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. 4 weeks later, proximity fuses accounted for 79% of all P.O.Z.I.T destroyed by anti-aircraft guns. On one remarkable day, 82% of incoming missiles fell to proximity-fused fire. The mathematics stunned German observers monitoring the campaign. The Luftwaffe had calculated that traditional anti-aircraft fire would prove insufficient to stop the V-1 offensive. British guns were achieving kill rates that should have been impossible with conventional ammunition. German technical intelligence finally began to grasp that the Allies possessed a revolutionary fuse technology. But the embargo on ground use meant no physical examples reached German laboratories for analysis. The breakthrough for German intelligence came in October 1944, though they didn't immediately recognize it. When Allied forces captured Antwerp, V-1 attacks shifted to the critical Belgian port. The combined chiefs of staff authorized proximity fuse use over continental Europe on October 25. Thousands of shells were now being fired in conditions where German recovery became possible. Dud shells began appearing in German-held territory. Technical recovery teams collected fragments and occasionally intact examples. The initial German analysis revealed disturbing truths. The fuses contained miniature vacuum tubes, smaller than anything German industry produced. The radar transmitter operated on frequencies German engineers hadn't considered practical for such applications. The entire device demonstrated a level of miniaturization and ruggedization that German electronics industry couldn't replicate. Most troubling was the realization that American factories were producing these sophisticated devices in quantities suggesting fully mature mass production. By December 1944, German technical intelligence had reconstructed enough information to understand the basic operating principles. Rheinmetall Borsig restarted proximity fuse research. Engineers worked frantically to develop German versions. They tested several hundred working prototypes of various designs. But working prototypes in a laboratory bore no resemblance to mass production capacity. Germany lacked the industrial infrastructure, the specialized components, the trained workforce, and most critically, the time. The Battle of the Bulge provided German forces with their most comprehensive look at American proximity, fuse capabilities, and their own limitations. Hitler's last major offensive in the West launched on December 16th, with 200,000 troops, 1,000 tanks, and the element of complete surprise. The initial German bombardment achieved its objectives. American frontline positions crumbled. Wehrmacht formations poured through the gaps in the Ardennes forest. At Monschau, Colonel Oskar Axelson faced an immediate crisis. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, lightly armed reconnaissance troops, faced overwhelming German assault from the 326th Volksgrenadier Division. Conventional artillery couldn't stop the attack. Axelson had just received a new type of shell, marked P.O.Z.I.T. Orders explicitly restricted their use without authorization from Supreme Headquarters. Axelson decided the emergency justified disobedience. He ordered his gunners to load and fire the proximity-fused shells. The effect shocked both sides. German soldiers advancing in standard assault formation suddenly encountered artillery fire that detonated 30 to 50 feet above their positions. Each explosion created a cone of steel fragments, covering vastly more area than ground-burst shells. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had survived years of Soviet artillery, found themselves helpless against shells that seemed to possess intelligence. The fragments found them in foxholes, behind trees, in ditches. Traditional defensive positions offered no protection. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Within hours, word of the weapon's effectiveness reached General Eisenhower's headquarters. The desperate situation developing across the Ardennes front demanded every available advantage. On December 19th, 3 days after Axelson's unauthorized deployment, Eisenhower formally requested authorization to use proximity fuses throughout the European theater. 2 days later, all restrictions were lifted. The embargo that had protected the secret for 2 years ended because the alternative was potential defeat. The distribution demonstrated American logistical superiority. Within 48 hours, proximity-fused shells reached artillery units across the entire Bulge battlefield. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received their allocation just as German forces completed the encirclement. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion began using them to defend the northwest approaches. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Barnes, employed them with devastating effectiveness southwest of the besieged town. General George Patton's Third Army, racing north to relieve Bastogne, fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells between December 22nd and December 29th. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed new tactics specifically for proximity fuse employment. The time-on-target concentration brought shells from multiple battalions arriving simultaneously at optimal height. When dozens of proximity-fused shells detonated together above German positions, the effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers called it the bell toll of death. At Elsenborn Ridge, American forces held critical terrain against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Over 3 days, December 17th through 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds. Approximately 40,000 carried proximity fuses. These 25% of shells accounted for an estimated 60% of the 5,000 German casualties. The mathematics were undeniable. Proximity fuses multiplied American firepower by a factor of 4. The captured ammunition depot near Stavelot was one of several seized during the German advance. Wehrmacht technical intelligence teams recovered approximately 600 proximity-fused shells intact. Additional dud shells were collected from impact sites across the Ardennes. These specimens reached Berlin laboratories within days, shipped under highest priority classification. The analysis teams at the Technical Research Office in Berlin approached their task with thoroughgating thoroughness. They photographed every component. They measured dimensions with precision instruments. They carefully disassembled the fuses under controlled conditions, documenting each step. What they discovered forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about German industrial capabilities and American achievements. The miniature vacuum tubes represented manufacturing sophistication Germany couldn't replicate. Sylvania's rugged pentodes measured barely larger than a pencil eraser, yet contained all functional elements of standard radio tubes. German industry produced nothing comparable. The tubes had survived firing acceleration exceeding 20,000 times gravity, forces that would reduce German vacuum tubes to glass powder and metal fragments. The internal construction revealed design principles and manufacturing techniques German engineers recognized as years beyond their current capabilities. The battery system demonstrated elegant simplicity that German over-engineering had overlooked. The glass ampule containing electrolyte, designed to shatter under firing acceleration and activate through centrifugal force, solved power supply problems German researchers still struggled with in laboratory conditions. American engineers had created a self-activating power source, requiring no external switches, no mechanical triggers, no complex safety mechanisms. It simply worked. The radar transmitter operated at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz, using the shell body itself as an antenna. German engineers had explored similar concepts, but concluded the necessary miniaturization was impossible given available components and manufacturing tolerances. American industry had solved problems German scientists believed unsolvable, then mass-produced the solutions at a rate suggesting industrial capacity Germany could never match. The technical report submitted to the Reich Ministry of Armaments in late January 1945 made devastating reading for German leadership. The conclusions were stark and unambiguous. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to replicate American proximity fuse technology. Even if all resources were diverted to crash development, production couldn't begin for at least 6 months. More realistically, 18 months to 2 years would be required to establish manufacturing capability approaching American output levels. The report detailed specific insurmountable obstacles. German electronics industry couldn't produce vacuum tubes meeting the required specifications. The specialized glass compositions, internal construction techniques, and quality control procedures were beyond current German capabilities. Development would require extensive research, retooling of manufacturing facilities, and training of specialized workforce. None of these could occur while Germany fought a losing war on multiple fronts against enemies with overwhelming material superiority. The radar components presented similar challenges. Miniaturization to the necessary degree required manufacturing precision German industry couldn't maintain under wartime conditions. The frequencies chosen by American designers lay outside the range of German radio component production. Creating new components would demand research and development time Germany didn't possess. Most damning was the conclusion about production scale. Even if Germany somehow developed a working proximity fuse, manufacturing capacity would be measured in thousands per month, perhaps tens of thousands with extraordinary effort. American factories were producing 70,000 per day by early 1945. The disparity wasn't a factor of 2 or 3, it was orders of magnitude. Germany couldn't compete. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The assessment included a brutally honest evaluation of when Germany might have achieved proximity fuse capability if development had continued from the 1930s research. The analysis suggested Germany was approximately 8 years behind American progress. The pre-war research that Germany abandoned in 1940 had been at roughly the same stage as American efforts in 1940. But while Germany diverted resources elsewhere, American industry had spent 4 years transforming laboratory prototypes into weapons mass-produced by the millions. Those 8 years represented the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical implementation. German engineers understood proximity fuse principles. They had working laboratory prototypes, but they had never solved the manufacturability problems, never developed the industrial processes, never created the supply chains necessary for mass production. American engineers had done all of this while simultaneously fighting a global war and maintaining the highest standard of living among all combatant nations. the implications extended far beyond proximity fuses. The German technical teams recognized that their analysis revealed fundamental weaknesses in German industrial organization and research priorities. Germany had pursued technical perfection in individual weapons while neglecting the industrial infrastructure necessary to produce adequate quantities. They had developed advanced designs that couldn't be manufactured reliably or maintained in field conditions. They had prioritized theoretical superiority over practical effectiveness. American industry had taken the opposite approach. Design for manufacturability. Prioritize reliability over technical sophistication. Create weapons that ordinary soldiers could operate and ordinary mechanics could maintain. Build supply chains that could sustain massive production while adapting to combat feedback. The Sherman tank and the proximity fuse both exemplified this philosophy, and both had proven decisive in ways German technical superiority couldn't overcome. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's post-war interrogation on May 10, 1945, provided additional confirmation. When General Karl Spaatz asked, "Have you any knowledge of a proximity fuse?" Göring responded that German fuses would have been in production in 3 or 4 months. This estimate, given after Germany's defeat, aligned closely with the Technical Research Office's assessment from January. Even Göring, notorious for optimistic projections, couldn't claim Germany was close to matching American capability. But Göring's estimate contained its own delusion. German factories would have needed far longer than 3 or 4 months. They would have needed to solve miniaturization problems that American industry had spent years overcoming. They would have needed to create entirely new production processes. They would have needed components and materials Germany couldn't source. Most critically, they would have needed the war to pause while German industry retooled, something the advancing Allied armies had no intention of permitting. The strategic impact of proximity fuses during the Battle of the Bulge was substantial, but not decisive on its own. The offensive failed because Germany lacked fuel, reinforcements, and air superiority. However, proximity fuses significantly increased German casualties and accelerated the Wehrmacht's defeat. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt testified post-war. "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down, not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso von Manteuffel, 5th Panzer Army commander, provided similar assessment. "The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops. The psychological impact matched the physical casualties. German soldiers who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front found themselves unnerved by weapons that defied their understanding of artillery. The 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired during the Battle of the Bulge accounted for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, approximately 20% of total German losses. The weapon achieved 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness than conventional ammunition, while requiring minimal additional training for gun crews. Forward observers no longer needed careful adjustment of fire. The fuses found their own optimal detonation point. Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, provided another demonstration of proximity fuse effectiveness against air targets. The Luftwaffe launched 900 fighters in a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields. Initial damage was severe, with many Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground. But returning German pilots encountered walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns. The kill rate stunned both sides. The Luftwaffe never recovered from these losses. By February 1945, maintaining secrecy became pointless. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers on both sides had witnessed their effects. On January 6th, the War Department authorized limited public disclosure. The New York Times reported a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns without, explaining the technology in detail. The secret that had been protected for years was finally acknowledged, though full technical details remained classified for decades. German intelligence produced their final assessment on January 10th, recognizing the weapon's significance too late for any countermeasures. The report stated, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." No countermeasures existed because Germany lacked the industrial capacity to develop them while simultaneously fighting a losing war. The broader implications of the proximity fuse extended to fundamental questions about military-industrial capacity in modern warfare. Germany had entered World War II with technical advantages in many weapons systems. German scientists and engineers possessed knowledge and expertise exceeding most opponents. German tanks, aircraft, and weapons often demonstrated superior individual specifications. However, Germany lacked the industrial depth to maintain those advantages through sustained mass production while fighting enemies on multiple fronts. Technical sophistication without the manufacturing capacity to implement it at scale proved functionally worthless. A Panther tank with a superior gun that broke down before engaging the enemy couldn't compete with a Sherman that reliably reached the battlefield. A proximity fuse that existed only as laboratory prototype couldn't counter millions of American proximity fuses in operational use. The United States entered the war with weapons often less technically sophisticated, but possessed industrial capacity to manufacture them in overwhelming quantities, while continuously improving quality based on combat feedback. American factories produced nearly as many Sherman tanks as Germany produced tanks of all types combined. American industry manufactured 22 million proximity fuses, while German industry never got a single type into production. This disparity decided the war's outcome as certainly as any battle. The proximity fuse program generated technological advances that transformed post-war industry. The miniaturized vacuum tubes became foundations for modern electronics. Quality control procedures established for fuse production became industry standards across manufacturing sectors. The organizational methods coordinating hundreds of suppliers pioneered modern supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen applied his miniaturization expertise to satellite instrumentation, later discovering Earth's radiation belts. The radar principles evolved into modern guidance systems. The concept of autonomous sensors making decisions without human intervention became the foundation for guided missiles and eventually all smart weapons. Every precision-guided munition deployed today descends from the proximity fuse, the first weapon that could sense its environment and choose its own detonation moment. The revolution begun in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields, where smart weapons dominate warfare. The human cost behind the statistics deserves acknowledgement. German soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the war's final stages, died in ways traditional warfare had never contemplated. They were killed by weapons that seemed to possess intelligence, that could find them wherever they hid. American production workers paid their own price. Factory accidents were hushed for security. Workers at Crosley Corporation, Sylvania, and other facilities suffered breakdowns from stress and exhaustion, producing weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing their purpose. Yet the moral calculation of war resists simplification. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, casualties might have been substantially higher. The war might have lasted longer. Every day the war shortened, potentially saved thousands in concentration camps awaiting liberation. The proximity fuse helped end a war that needed ending. The mathematics were brutal but clear. The lessons German engineers learned at the cost of their nation's defeat influenced post-war military thinking. When West Germany established the Bundeswehr and began developing the Leopard 1 main battle tank in the 1950s, designers consciously emphasized reliability and maintainability over pure performance specifications. They studied American automotive engineering principles and deliberately applied them to military vehicle development. The resulting Leopard 1 incorporated design philosophies that made the Sherman successful, becoming one of the most successful tank designs of the Cold War era. The proximity fuse story ultimately concerns transformation at multiple levels. Technological transformation as warfare entered the age of autonomous weapons. Tactical transformation as artillery evolved from support arm to decisive battlefield tool. Industrial transformation as mass production techniques revolutionized manufacturing. Strategic transformation as material capacity proved more decisive than technical sophistication. Most profoundly, it demonstrated that in industrial warfare, the ability to produce adequate quantities of reliable weapons matters more than possession of theoretically superior designs that can't be manufactured at scale. Germany possessed scientific knowledge approaching American levels. German engineers understood proximity, fuse principles, and had explored similar concepts. But understanding problems and solving them are fundamentally different challenges. American industry solved the problems German engineers didn't realize they needed to solve. American factories mass-produced solutions to challenges German scientists considered insurmountable. American logistics delivered these weapons to the battlefield in quantities that transformed tactical calculations. The convergence of American scientific innovation, industrial capacity, and tactical adaptation created advantages Germany couldn't overcome through technical sophistication alone. The 600 proximity fuses captured near Stavelot in December 1944 told the complete story. Each device represented 4 years of American research, development, and industrial mobilization. Each demonstrated manufacturing capabilities Germany couldn't replicate. Each proved that the industrial war had already been decided, even as fighting continued across Europe. The German engineers who analyzed these captured fuses confronted evidence that their nation had lost the competition that mattered most, the competition to transform scientific knowledge into battlefield capability at the scale modern warfare demanded. The Battle of the Bulge ended January 25, 1945, with German forces in full retreat. Hitler's last offensive had cost approximately 100,000 German casualties while achieving nothing strategic. American losses totaled 75,000, including 19,000 killed. The proximity fuse had proven itself not merely as an artillery improvement, but as a war-winning technology that fundamentally changed warfare's mathematics. From Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16 through the systematic deployment of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes, proximity fuses demonstrated that scientific innovation, backed by industrial capacity, provided decisive military advantage. The convergence of American research excellence, manufacturing sophistication, and tactical flexibility created weapons that shaped the war's outcome and defined the technological age that followed. In those frozen Belgian forests where German engineers examined captured American fuses, the future of warfare became visible. The age of autonomous weapons had begun. The side with superior industrial capacity and manufacturing maturity would prevail over opponents with greater theoretical knowledge but inadequate implementation capability. These lessons shaped not just World War II's conclusion, but the entire structure of military competition that followed into the Cold War and beyond. The German technical assessment concluding they were 8 years behind American proximity fuse development wasn't merely about one weapon system. It was recognition that Germany had lost the industrial war that determined victory in modern conflict. Those 8 years represented the difference between laboratory prototypes and battlefield weapons, between scientific understanding and manufacturing reality, between technical sophistication and practical effectiveness. The proximity fuse remains one of World War II's most important technological innovations, ranked alongside radar and the atomic bomb in strategic significance. Yet it never received comparable public attention, perhaps because its impact was incremental rather than dramatic, measured in improved artillery effectiveness rather than mushroom clouds. But for the German soldiers who died beneath proximity-fused air bursts in the Ardennes, and for the American soldiers whose lives those fuses saved, the weapon's importance was absolute and undeniable. The mathematics of warfare had been rewritten by miniature radar sets in artillery shells. The industrial age of conflict had fully arrived. The nation that could transform scientific knowledge into mass-produced weapons faster and in greater quantities would determine the outcome. In December 1944, that nation was the United States. Germany's recognition of this truth came too late. delivered through analysis of captured fuses that demonstrated American capabilities 8 years ahead of German progress. The lesson echoes across decades. In modern conflict, innovation without implementation capability is merely interesting science. Technical sophistication without manufacturing capacity is functionally irrelevant. Industrial maturity and production excellence matter more than theoretical superiority in weapons that exist only on drawing boards. These truths, written in the frozen ground of the Ardennes and confirmed by German engineers analyzing captured American proximity fuses, remain as valid today as they were in 1944. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.